My great pleasure to introduce Dr. Dan Cooper as our final keynote speaker. Dan is the Chair of Pediatrics at UC Irvine and the Chief Academic Officer at Chalks Children's Hospital. He's the Director of UCI's Institute for Clinical and Translational Sciences, which helps to bridge the gap between basic science discoveries and real improvement in healthcare. Dan received his MD degree from the University of California, San Francisco in 1974 and completed his pediatric training at NYU Bellevue Medical Center and went on to a 3-year fellowship in pediatric pulmonary medicine under the mentorship of Dr. Robert Mellons at Babies Hospital at Columbia University. Dan is a first-class pediatrician, pediatric pulmonologist, and former director of a very busy pediatric intensive care unit. His career in research, teaching, and clinical care has been formed by working with children with diseases like asthma, cystic fibrosis, and lung disease, all conditions in which chronic inflammation takes a terrible toll on the child's health. His research has focused on the mechanisms that link exercise, growth, and health in babies and children. He's the founder of the Pediatric Exercise and Genomics Research Center here at UCI, which was founded in 2003. He's dedicated, PERC, the Pediatric Exercise Research Center, is dedicated to uncovering the biological mechanisms of exercise that can be used to improve lifelong health of children with chronic disease and disability using exercise as medicine. Dan was one of the principal investigators of Project Healthy, a pioneering national study involving over 3,000 middle schools, children designed to reduce obesity and type 2 diabetes through school-based nutrition and PE programs. And the results of that project were published in the prestigious journal, the New England Journal of Medicine. Dan's laboratory is currently funded by grants from the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute and the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development. Dan is one of the motivators behind this exercise medicine and sports science initiative. He sits on the internal advisory committee. He's a good friend and colleague. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to welcome Dr. Dan Cooper.
So I don't know if it's good or bad that I'm the last one here. I'll have to think about that. So first of all, Jim, thank you. And I think this has been a really delightful day for everybody. The sessions have been really, really stimulating, and I have learned a lot. I think everybody here has really seen something amazing about what the University of California, Irvine has in the field of exercise as medicine. And we really can be leaders nationally and internationally in this field, which is becoming so important. So what I thought that I would do, and I'll try to go through my slides pretty quickly and leave a lot of time for discussion, is talk about that exercise in children ain't just play anymore. It's really quite important for growth and development. There's a lot of science behind it, and there's a lot of work we really need to do before we can really say that we know how to use exercise in its most beneficial ways. This is a wheelchair that was developed by one of our great scholars here at UC Irvine, Dr. David Renkensmeyer, who's a mechanical engineer. It's a child with cerebral palsy who, until this wheelchair was developed, really couldn't mobilize herself with any degree of precision. And with this haptic robotic wheelchair, she now can, and she's quite delighted. So what I'd like to do briefly is figure out how exercise and physical activity influence growth and development in children. A little bit about the role of exercise in prevention across the lifespan. A little bit about the role of exercise in people with chronic disease and disability. And I really enjoy all of your questions. Oh, okay. Okay, just so you know, we're really reaching a stage where organizations like the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services are recommending and recognizing that activity, physical activity and exercise during childhood is critical. And one of the major themes that's developing in pediatric health is this idea of critical periods of growth and development. And critical periods of growth and development means that something that happens for a relatively limited time, perhaps in utero and early childhood, can influence health throughout life. Now, I think all of us have had a feeling that this was true intuitively, but as I'll show you in a few minutes, we're really beginning to understand the biological mechanisms behind this really remarkable phenomenon of childhood origins of adult disease and the terribly critical role that physical activity plays in that. So I thought I would, following Joan's really delightful talk this morning, just tell you a little bit about why am I interested in this stuff. So this is a chest x-ray of a child with a disease called cystic fibrosis. You don't have to be a radiologist to look at this chest x-ray and see that there's something wrong with it. It doesn't have that usual aerated, dark features that you would see in a normal chest x-ray. You can see that there's just a lot of gunk in this poor child's lung, and this is one of the characteristics of this disease, cystic fibrosis, which is a lung disease that occurs very early in life. And it's characterized by chronic inflammation. And when I just was learning how to become a pediatrician in the late 1970s, the average age at which these children died was 14 or 15 years of age. And now it's about 40 or 45 years with some absolutely remarkable changes. And one of the first great bits of evidence about helping to have these kids lead a longer life was some work that was done by some friends of mine back at the University of Pittsburgh. And they wrote an article which appeared in the New England Journal of Medicine. And in it, they showed that those children with cystic fibrosis who were physically active and who had high and good cardiopulmonary exercise tests had a better quality of life and lived longer than those who didn't. And I was very, very interested in this. I was interested in breathing and the lung. And I was further interested in this because I'll never forget, as a young resident taking care of a child with cystic fibrosis whose lungs looked like this. And he was in the pediatric ICU at NYU Bellevue, and we knew that he was going to die. There was very little that we could do. And, you know, I felt this great emptiness that all physicians feel from time to time, which is you've reached the limit of everything you know that you can do for this particular human being, this fellow individual. And I sort of said, you know, I think that I would like to try to sort of push those boundaries back, both because of the experience I had in learning to become a pediatrician, and maybe I could contribute something. So that combination really led me to a research career, along with my clinical career, in which I focused on exercise and breathing. And I think it's been fruitful in that we've really started to see how exercise can really play an important role in health. Children are not just miniature adults. I had to put these maskings here because of HIPAA violation. So this is a good audience. Yeah, we have to do all kinds of things. But this is a sort of a mantra of those of us who do child health research, is that we're always lumped with everybody, and we're the junior researchers, or, you know, we're the little people researchers, and children they have a very different physiology, and they have this different physiology really because they're growing. And, you know, we see this, and we know that there is this relationship between physical activity and growth, because growth is impaired in many children with chronic diseases or disabilities. This is a child with spina bifida, which is a nutritionally related congenital disease in which the spinal cord doesn't form correctly, and often these children have a great deal of problem walking. And so is physical activity. And so it occurred to many of us that growth and physical activity were related. So when I started thinking about this earlier in my career, this is something I did. You know, we didn't have the kind of ability to draw on computers that we do now. So this was something that I kind of drew with a typewriter. And you have physical growth. We have the requirements of locomotion. We have gas transport systems, heart, lung, blood. This was my idea back in 1982, I should say, about how these things were related. And you can see it's become a little bit more complicated as time goes on. And I'm glad to say that we now really understand, or beginning to understand, how physical activity and growth are really related at a molecular level. And we're not going to go through this. I just want to point out one or two things. First of all, just some of the players. Insulin, we all know how critical insulin is for blood glucose regulation. It's also critical for growth. This hormone here called IGF-1, or insulin-like growth factor 1, is also critically important for growth, and they're related. And now we have all these intracellular mechanisms which are affected by these hormones, which are subsequently affected by exercise and/or training. And so this is the beginning of a much more formal and rigorous scientific and methodological approach that links exercise with growth. And we won't go into this, as I said, except this is the kind of research that we're trying to do when we want to understand the real biological mechanisms through which exercise can affect growth and help kids. So growth and development, of course, is one of the most thrilling elements of the human experience. Every parent watches that occur in their own children. And so we believe that a deeper understanding of the intersecting biological mechanisms of growth and physical activity enhance the concept of exercise medicine in children who are healthy and in children with chronic disease. I'm just going to show this quickly. So what are some of the aspects of growth that are relevant to exercise? So first of all, growth is time constrained. We've got this critical window of growth, and if there is a very special impact of exercise on growth, it's got to occur within those years up to about the end of puberty and early young adulthood. And all I want to point out is that growth depends on genetics. It depends on physiological events like health or disease. It depends on environmental inputs like diet, physical activity. I wasn't being cute here when I put love in there. We have this phenomenon that we know in pediatrics that's called psychosocial dwarfism, where a child who is abused or deprived of a normal family and severely abused will literally not grow. And so there is a direct connection between the kind of environment in which we live and whether you're going to have successful growth or not. And we also know that it's a robust system. We can have periods of disease where maybe growth slows down, and then the body knows by some miraculous mechanism that we haven't figured out yet that we should catch up. And how this works are still mysterious questions, and what the role of exercise is in a child who's been sick and now is healthy is one of the great research questions that we still have to solve. Now, if we look at the aspects of exercise that are relevant to growth, so in a sort of a parallel way, I wonder if is there a way to sort of, there we go. So the effects are constrained also by time. They depend on environmental inputs such as diet, technology, and we've talked a lot about fun. Those of you who were in the session this morning know that, sure, we can tell kids to exercise, but go put a 9-year-old on a treadmill and tell them to exercise like you would at the 24-hour fitness, and it's not going to happen. Fun and play are not trivial. They are biological. And we have to start asking ourselves, why does a child perceive a certain kind of exercise as fun from a biological point of view? One of the themes that we're going to harp upon over and over and over again in this talk is that the reason that we're even having this day is because human beings have removed themselves from the ecological and evolutionary niche into which we actually developed. We do not live in an environment where we're out in the open, where we need to be physically active to get food, and we need to be physically active to avoid predators. That environment has disappeared. I'll talk about that a little bit more. And so something that we're all talking about is how do we replace that environment into which we evolved into this overbuilt modern society. And the negative consequences we'll talk about in a moment as well. So just like there can be problems with each of these factors with growth, exercise has to be put into place in a manner that responds to both the environmental and the physiological state of the child. Exercise is dependent on every one of those factors, just as growth is. Exercise can stimulate the growth of many, many tissues. This is a very important point. So this is muscle, and we all know that if you work out, your muscles will grow. This is a mitochondria. This is the energy-producing organelle of every cell. And when you exercise, you can actually stimulate an increase in the number of these mitochondria in your cells. and we don't really yet understand exactly why that happens. Bone, a very, very important organ, I think we would all agree. So one of the first diseases that was recognized, diseases of the elderly that was recognized as having origins in childhood is osteoporosis. Now, osteoporosis, as many of you know, is this demineralization of the bones that occurs or becomes more manifest, usually later in life. And it can become so severe that people have, what's called pathological fractures. They're going up a step or they simply put their foot down too hard and all of a sudden they've fractured one of their bones because the bones are so demineralized. Well, it turns out that the amount of mineral in the bone is dependent on a number of factors, your genes, your nutrition, and really interestingly, the amount of physical activity that you do in daily life, and even more importantly, the amount of physical activity that you do during the first 2 or 3 decades of life. And after the first 2 or 3 decades of life, the ability of physical activity to stimulate new bone formation and bone mineralization is almost gone. So we have this window during childhood where proper uses of exercise can help prevent diseases much later in life. And I think this is true for diseases of the muscle, and as you'll see, it's probably true for diseases of the brain and cognition as well. It can affect neurons. Exercise can affect neurons, and exercise can affect blood vessels. Here you can see an untrained picture of a blood vessel going through a muscle, and after training, this dye represents the new blood vessel growth. So exercise has a very, very powerful growth effect by itself. I'm not going to talk about all of our hypotheses, but we've tried to use every tool we can to understand this process. And this was in a study that we did many years ago, and our hypothesis was that if we could block some of the key hormones that are related to both growth and to exercise, and then we took an animal, in this case a rat, and we trained it, we would block the training effect. And remember, the training effect is something that we all experience. You start exercising, your muscles get bigger, you're able to do more exercise at the end of the training period than you were before. And one of the hormones that's related in both growth and exercise is called growth hormone. Every time you go out and exercise, you get a burst of growth hormone. And when we look at a child, particularly at puberty, we find that growth hormone throughout the day is going like this. And during puberty, all of a sudden, the amplitude of these growth hormone bursts and their frequency start going like this. So there's this really interesting correlation between the growth effects of exercise and growth itself. So we thought, gee, if we could block growth hormone, we would eliminate the training effect. And the way we blocked growth hormone was we didn't do anything too bad to the animals. We simply gave them what was called anti-growth hormone releasing hormone antibodies, which was a very elegant way of specifically stopping growth hormone. And you can see in these 2 rats, this is the treated rat, it's much smaller. So our experiment worked in that sense. But when we trained these animals, contrary to our hypothesis, what we found was these animals actually trained better than these animals. And from this, and I'm not going to go into this, we learned an awful lot about the mechanisms of how growth and exercise are related from a very technical point of view. Some of the other areas that we're looking at, which I think are at the forefront, is we're looking at white blood cells. So these are white blood cells. And what we've discovered is that brief exercise can alter health-promoting genes and what we call epigenetic, and I'll talk about this in a second, in circulating monocytes. The monocyte is a very interesting white blood cell because when you look at people who have atherosclerotic disease, hardening of the arteries and plaques, when you look at those plaques, what you find is an infiltration of these monocytes. And we now believe from our early studies that exercise may be able to actually regulate the gene programming of these white blood cells and make them switch from potentially damaging white blood cells to more healthy white blood cells. This is another area that we think is very exciting in our research. Oops, I don't want to skip the babies. And one of our foci in the lab is also on physical activity in the first year of life. And we have a project that's actually looking at physical activity in babies who were born prematurely. So babies who are born prematurely, as you know, miss a really important part of being in the womb, which is that third trimester. And those of you who have been pregnant, and I only know this because of the person that I live with, know that that third trimester is a time when all parents are excited because this baby starts moving around, and you can feel the baby moving around. And again, it's not just play or for naught. In fact, the baby is learning how to increasingly exist and push its sort of gym, right? It's elastic forces. And we know that if there are certain anomalies where sometimes the shoulder doesn't form correctly, for example, and the baby is unable to move its shoulder, and you look at the result, which is the same kind of muscle atrophy. In other words, the muscle doesn't form as would happen if, I don't know, how many of you have ever been in a cast for a broken bone? So if you have, you know that when you take the cast off, your arm or your leg is about 1/3 or 1/4 of the original size, because when you don't use a muscle, it simply starts to shrink. So the baby born prematurely misses that period of time. We put them in the NICU, and we now can, of course, save these babies in ways that when I started practicing as a pediatrician, we couldn't even dream of. But we bundle these babies up, and we increase energy intake, feeding, as much as we can, and we reduce their ability to move around. And many of us have felt that some of the consequences of prematurity, which include either failure to thrive in really slow growth for the rest of their lives, or they become obese sometimes, seemingly paradoxical, may result because they miss out on this period of physical activity in the first year of life. And so we've got a study where we're actually looking at what we call assisted exercise. We teach the parent or the caregiver how to do certain exercises. And we also think that this probably has a great deal to do with development and cognition, because when we do cognitive tests in a newborn, it's all about the baby's muscular or motor response to stimuli. We can't yet ask the baby, how do you like your environment? Are you really happy today? We do certain stimuli, and we watch the connection between what we hope is the baby's cognition and the motor. And so we're in the midst of this study, and hopefully within a year or two, we'll be able to tell you how good our program was. So why am I showing you a picture of a World War II U.S. plane dropping bombs in Germany? Because one of the most exciting scientific discoveries that has been made is, and very relevant to what we're talking about when we try to understand this relationship between physical activity and growth, is this new field, relatively new field of epigenetics. So before the epigenetic revolution, we thought we had it. We thought we knew everything, right? And this is the typical way we think in science, right? There's a new discovery. That's it. We've solved all the problems. So we cloned the human genome, and that was done by the early 2000s. And we figured, okay, we now know what these genes are, and all we have to do is figure out how each one of these genes is related to the protein that it produces, and then we'll know every disease that there is to know. And of course, that hasn't happened. And what we discovered is that there is a level of control over these genes that we couldn't even believe until we really started to do it. And the first bit of evidence that there was this epigenetic, meaning surrounding the genetic control, was from the hunger winter of 1944 and 1945. So the Netherlands was occupied by the Nazis, and there was a lot of guerrilla warfare. And so the Nazis said, you know, we're going to just cut your food off. Now, the Netherlands was a country in which there were fastidious medical records. So when a woman was pregnant, she was weighed on a regular basis. The babies that were born were weighed. The medical records were really, really excellent. So after the war, people looked at the records of what became known as the hunger winter, which is, again, when food was rationed and people had something like 700 calories a day to eat. So it was no surprise that the women who were pregnant during that period of time and who gave birth had small babies. That would be surprising to no one. But what was shocking, and this was discovered a couple decades later, was that the babies of those babies, who were now in relatively modern Holland, and who certainly whose moms were not restricted to 700 calories a day, those babies were small as well. And people began to understand that there is this set of mechanisms, and there are many of them, that have to do with how genes are expressed. And there are, it turns out, many, many ways that the body can figure out how to either keep genes from being expressed or stimulating them. You could put small pieces of genetic material which get in the way of the DNA expressing itself. The DNA itself is coated by proteins and all kinds of chemicals, and you can put little other chemicals in there which will keep that framework from ever opening up, and the gene can never express itself. Why is this important to us? Because it turns out that many of those epigenetic mechanisms can occur over a very short period of time and are influenced by factors like diet, exercise, emotional stress, and so forth and so on. And so for people like me who were trying to understand why would exercise in childhood have an effect that could last a lifetime, we now had a potential mechanism. And so we're studying these epigenetic mechanisms. What is it about a single bout of exercise or about training during the period of time when the child is rapidly growing that can turn into something that will affect the child throughout the lifespan? And this is a very, very fascinating area of research. So physical activity in children is not merely play. It is rather a fundamental factor in the very process of growth and development. I wanted to show you just this. Oops. So this was from Katarina Borer, who was one of the pioneers of this field. And she looked at the effect of exercise on body growth in the hamster. And she took a group of hamsters that had a running wheel and a group that didn't. And she looked at the growth rate. She looked at this growth hormone. And she looked at both the pulse and the frequency of the growth hormone bursts. And you see what she found was that those hamsters that were allowed a running wheel actually grew much better. And this is just to remind you that when you exercise, so this is time. We did 10 minutes of exercise. This is I think a 12-year-old kid. Here's growth hormone. And when you go out and exercise, you give yourself a burst of growth hormone. And we think that that burst of growth hormone is probably playing a very important effect in the overall impact of exercise, particularly in children. Now, this was an interesting study that we did because most of the ways that we were testing exercise in children were based on what had been done in adults. And as I alluded to earlier, we go to the gym, we say, I've got 1 hour to exercise, I'm going to sit on my bike. And, we rapidly discovered in our laboratory, as we started to look at kids and really study them, that it was a rare 9, 10, 11, or even teen that would sit on a cycle ergometer or a treadmill for a half an hour or 45 minutes. They would get bored. If they were on a mouthpiece, they would start moving around, and rather than keep beating the children, which I'm just joking, we thought maybe we better understand what natural patterns of physical activity are. Because when you really think about it, I would have a very different physiological motor if the kind of exercise I had to do was an hour of continuous, constant work rate exercise. If that's what I had to do to survive, I would build a different model than if, say, I had to be able to get up quickly and run away from the saber-toothed tiger before it ate me, right? And while I was running away from the saber-toothed tiger, I had to make sure that there was enough blood in my brain so that I could look around and say, gee, I better go that way and not that way because there's some shelter over there and there's none over there. So we actually started working with some friends of ours who were physical anthropologists at UCLA. And we said, what do you guys know about measuring energy expenditure in free living and human beings? I mean, people walking around. And it turned out we found these two physical anthropologists who were studying energy expenditure in hunting-gathering people. And this was back in the 90s, and there were still, and there are almost none left, a few places in the world where there are true hunting-gathering societies, much more probably similar to the environment into which all human beings evolved. Hunting-gathering societies, the men usually hunt, the women usually gather. Margaret Mead, who was a very, very famous physical anthropologist, had postulated that in those societies, energy expenditure among the men was much greater than the women because the men were out there hunting and the women were gathering. So this couple spent a lot of time in the Ituri forest looking at the pygmy people, who were one of the remaining hunting-gathering people. And the way they measured energy expenditure was by direct observation. They would sit there with their notebooks, and they discovered that the minimum amount of time that you could make a decent observation was 3 seconds, and that by 20 minutes, the observer became so fatigued that the rest of the observations, unless he or she took a break, were meaningless. And so they did this. And one of their big discoveries was, as many of you probably realize, that in fact, energy expenditure was a little bit more in the women, and here's why. See, the men would go off on a hunt, and they would make a big deal about it. I mean, they would dance around with their spears and everything like that, and they would go off into the forest, and they'd say, we'll be back in a couple weeks with some new antelope or something. And what the men did was they had, from their previous hunts, found a place to camp, and they made their home beer. And they would hang around for about 5 days drinking the beer. Then they would kill an antelope, and then they would go marching back into the village. You know, now, in the meantime, the women there were crops, there were children to take care of, there was the homes to keep clean, there was agriculture that they were taking care of. So anyway, we used their techniques to follow children around in Westwood, and we wanted to characterize the natural pattern of physical activity. So this is just typical what we found over about a 20-minute period. And as any observer of children know, this is no surprise. This is time. This is roughly how intense the exercise is. Most of the kids are going up and down, and they start, stop. They don't sit. It's not like they're sitting on a treadmill for 20 minutes. And there's a few episodes where this is the intensity of the exercise. This gets really, really heavy. And I think in many, many sports, not necessarily marathon running, but if you watch a basketball game or less so a baseball game, but a volleyball game, the active sports, you'll find this, surprisingly, that this is, in fact, the pattern of physical activity in most human beings. Mostly what we do is short bursts of exercise, mostly moderate intensity, with an occasional burst of very, very heavy exercise. And this really is important because it changes the way you think about how our heart, lungs, and brains must work, and the skills that a child must develop to have survived in the world into which we evolved. Not the world in which we live, but the world in which we evolved. Doing research is a lot of fun. We have done all kinds of studies of exercise training in children, and we did a study which measured energy expenditure with a very elegant technique called the doubly labeled water technique. And I don't need to explain this, but we gave the kids, they had to drink a specially labeled water, and then we had to collect their urine. And here's some of the art that we got from the kids. Tim was one of our study associates. My name is Tim, and here's my pee. So we thought that this was one of the benefits of working with kids, is the art. Let's spend a few minutes on something that I think is quite relevant to today, and that is, of course, the problem of obesity. And the caption is, this is these two little kids, which remember when we used to have to fatten the kids up front. So we say this with humor, but this remains one of the great failures so far of our ability to deal with obesity. I want to preface this by making clear that we understand something. This goes back 12 years ago from an article in the journal Science. In the meantime, a different kind of understanding is called for. Obesity is not a personal failing. In trying to lose weight, the obese are fighting a difficult battle. We'll talk about this in a second. It is a battle against biology, a battle that only the intrepid take on, and one in which only a few prevail. And what he meant by a battle against biology is that, again, think back to the environment into which we evolved as human beings. Food was much scarcer. So it's not surprising that it's easier to get people to eat than it is to get them to exercise. And the reason is clearly because in those days, you didn't know when your next meal was coming from. And so when food was available, it would be biologically advantageous to eat as much as you could. And those genes remain in many of us to this day. And it's a struggle because our biology is telling you, if the food is there, you really better use it, because it may not be there in 4 hours or in 2 hours if you're snacking. And so we've got to remember this when we think of this, that it is not a trivial problem. And in fact, we've discovered that it's not a trivial problem. I wanted to just show you, yes. So we see this in children, of course. This is a very nice family. I took care of this family. You can't quite see this, but this child had lung disease, and he had to be hospitalized. One of the things that we won't have time to talk about is when obese children get sick, when they get pneumonias, they tend to be sicker. This child actually ended up in the intensive care unit, and he ended up with a tracheostomy. His mom already, they were a Hispanic family, his mom already had type 2 diabetes, which, as you know, in Hispanics and African Americans and certain Native Americans, the per pound of obesity, the actual development of diabetes is much more rapid for reasons that we don't yet completely understand. And Dad walked in with this. I didn't ask him to put the Krispy Kreme donut. I told him I would take the picture, and he said it was absolutely fine. Anyway, we do know that there are many, many complications in children that are related to diabetes. And they range from hypertension, type 2 diabetes, increased cardiovascular disease risk, depression, learning disorders, liver disease, and as I said, increased type 2 diabetes. And at the really excellent conference led earlier today by Dr. Schneider and Dr. Taylor Lucas, they really went through their wonderful, wonderful efforts with the schools to see if we can do something to get around this problem. What is disturbing is, I can't move the slide forward. There we go. That we, as we continue to look at this problem, this is a fairly recent article from the Journal of the American Medical Association, 2013. Overall, there have been no significant changes in obesity prevalence in youth or adults between 2003-4 and 2011-12. So this is a very, very difficult problem. Here's a fairly recent article from 2014, New England Journal, The Incidence of Childhood Obesity. This is very disturbing. Incident obesity between the ages of 5 and 14 years was more likely to have occurred at younger ages, primarily among children who had entered kindergarten overweight, which is why Candace, who's in the audience, is so interested in trying to institute throughout the clinics in Orange County very early in life preventive programs. Because here you're seeing that the die may be cast for a lifetime of obesity through some of these epigenetic mechanisms, perhaps, far earlier than we'd ever thought. I'm going to end with just comparing obesity to another disease, and I think that this really brings home the point of how serious a problem is. And we laugh about it, but as a pediatrician, I mean, I have taken care of children with all kinds of diseases. And I was always struck by the comparison between a very, very rare, almost inevitably fatal unless treated disease, such as leukemia, and obesity. So leukemia, childhood leukemia, the most common kind of childhood leukemia is called acute lymphocytic leukemia. These are these big, ugly, leukemic malignant cells, which you make the diagnosis, usually from a blood test. And these are fat cells. These are those big, ugly fat cells, which sometimes surround us in places that we don't want them to. Now, let's think about these two conditions for a moment. So let's compare leukemia and obesity. in terms of their occurrence, their outcome, their cause, and their treatment. So leukemia is very rare, 4.1 cases annually per 100,000 children. Obesity, on the other hand, is quite common, 16,000 cases per 100,000 in children less than 15 years of old. Now, leukemia, if untreated, is invariably fatal. There's been I think there's no recorded case of a spontaneous remission in childhood leukemia. However, the good news is that we're at about 80 to 85% cure of childhood leukemia now, and that's absolutely remarkable and is the subject of its own talk. And if untreated, there are few fatalities in children, but there are many comorbidities. But if you actually add up, and there are a few kids who die from obesity, from sleep disorders, and from other diseases that they can develop, and complications of other diseases that are made worse, it's almost the same number, and probably now more, than the number of children who die from this disease, leukemia. And there are many comorbidities that we mentioned, ranging from depression to liver disease and so forth and so on. The cause, we still don't really know what the cause of childhood leukemia is. We don't know why a cell becomes malignant. We have some ideas. Perhaps it's a virus. Perhaps it's an environmental stress. But we still haven't nailed this. And obesity, the cause is not rocket science. I mean, I know that there's all kinds of permutations. There's sugar and this environmental thing. But the bottom line is that your energy intake is much greater than your energy expenditure. Now, that can be modified by many things, but the fundamental cause is pretty clear. And if we're able to rebalance this in a child, we can solve the problem. It's just not easy to do that. Now, leukemia, treatment. So here's a disease that we do not understand. We don't know what the mechanism is. And up to 80% of these kids have a long-term survival. And in obesity, the treatment is still unknown and controversial. So if there's one takeaway message today about obesity and about exercise, it's that it's not trivial. It's a very complicated problem, and we haven't really succeeded in getting our hands and our arms around it. Maybe because we haven't treated it with the same kind of scientific rigor that we've looked at leukemia. I mean, if you look at the literature on what we understand about the genome and the leukemic cell, we have more fundamental biological knowledge, I believe, in that area than we do at a comparable level in understanding the interplay between obesity, physical activity, and growth in children. And I wanted to segue just to one of these things that we don't often think of. So as I said, about 80% of the children who have leukemia will survive. But we are finding, disturbingly, that many of these children are going on to become quite obese and to have an increased risk of cardiovascular disease. And we don't exactly know why that is. Some of us believe that it may be that these children are now considered to be very fragile by their parents. I mean, you can imagine if you had a child who had a life-threatening disease like leukemia, you may not agree to let him play football or even to stay out and play by himself. So that's one possibility. It may be that the drug regimen, which is, you can imagine, is a pretty serious group of drugs that the kids have to take for a pretty long period of time, may have done things to them cellularly which render them more likely to be obese. It may have to do with this phenomenon that I alluded to earlier that we called catch-up growth. It may be a sort of a funny kind of catch-up growth where the body, after it's gone through this really terrible time in which the child wasn't eating and there were drugs and there was the underlying disease, and now these things go away and some control mechanism in the body gets a little bit screwed up and says, let's get all the fat we possibly can. We had a really rough time out there, and it was a period of starvation, which genetically we may remember, and now it's time for us to bring in as much food and to store it as fat as we possibly can. These are areas of research that we really, really need to have a better grip on. And I'm going to end there because I would really, really love to have questions, and I know that it's late. So thank you for your attention. I see only about 60% of you are asleep, which is much better than would have ever dreamed or predicted. And I'd love to have questions and hear your comments, and I'd love to hear what your concerns are about this whole idea of exercise and growth and physical activity. I mean, I can keep talking for another 2 hours if you want me to, but so if you do, you better ask some questions.
I'm just curious how long it's going to take before your standard pediatrician hands out prescriptions for exercise when the family members come and be evaluated, no matter what the health of the kids or the family. When do you think that's going to happen?
So this is a great question. I didn't plant you, right? We don't know each other, right? So the question was, how long is it going to take for the average pediatrician to be able to, I'm going to add one word to your question, to give a scientifically based, intelligent exercise prescription to a child? It's really a good question. It's an area that we are very concerned with. So children are the most physically active human beings outside of athletes that spontaneously in the population. And this is true almost in any mammalian group. The younger species are more spontaneously physically active. And it's an essential component of growth, as I tried to show. And yet, the pediatrician, so I'm the chair of the pediatrics department, so I know what's the training is going on. There's really nothing about physical activity. Now, when the pediatrician sees the parent and the child, almost the first question that the pediatrician will ask is, you know, how's Johnny or Judy doing? Are they active? Are they physically active? You know, it's almost one of the first signs of whether a child is sick or not as to whether or not they remain physically active. And yet, if you were to ask the average pediatrician, well, what is the normal level of physical activity? They can't answer it. If I were to ask the average pediatrician who could tell me all of the gene mutations that are associated with acute lymphocytic leukemia, they could probably tell me all 300 or 400 of them. If I were to say what percentage of total energy expenditure, for example, is physical activity in a normal 7-year-old, they wouldn't have a clue. So the answer to your question is it's going to take a while. But we have really been fortunate, and I don't know if he's here, but Dr. Ruben Chen, who was in one of the talks earlier, and his family have been really, really generous and have helped us with a really substantial resource to put together a program which is designed to teach pediatricians what they need to know about physical activity. We don't think this is trivial or that this is an easy problem to solve. We have to get to the point where when the pediatricians complete their subspecialty and they have to take the board exam, that there will be questions about this. Because if there aren't questions in the board exam that determines whether they pass it and become, you know, get their accreditation, it won't be meaningful. So there is a great deal of political work that we have to do. But I think pediatricians, coaches, teachers, and of course parents, and everybody in the society have got to become advocates for greater knowledge about your question, which is, what is the right amount of physical activity?
So would it be too difficult to just hand out little bookmarks that says the Surgeon General recommends that you have 60 minutes of activity a day? Is that?
So that's easy to do. The problem is, and I think Margaret's already shaking her head, you know, you can give out all this stuff to parents. And you can give them, here's a sheet about tobacco prevention, and here's a sheet about diet, and here's a sheet about you got to have your kid take the Gardasil for, you know, the human papillovirus vaccine, and did you get your tetanus shot, you know, and it becomes one of these, you know, list of things that rarely. So what did I learn from my behavioralist friends? I didn't think I could learn anything until I met Margaret and her buddies, and that was that knowledge is not behavior. I can know stuff and it may not change my life at all. So I don't think that handing out a piece of paper from the Surgeon General will do the trick. I think that we need to take a fresh look at how the pediatrician evaluates physical activity. And this is something where the schools and the physicians could really work together. So in the session that Margaret led, she pointed out that there's this thing called the California Fitnessgram. So this is mandated by state law in 5th, 7th, and 9th grade. It comes from the Cooper Institute. I have nothing to do with them. And it's a series of tests, maybe 2 of which are relevant, and the rest are probably not relevant in terms of disease. But they do height and weight. They do either a mile run, which many of us think is really not a good test of physical activity, or they do a shuttle run. They do some estimate of physical activity. We can fix that. We can make that test better. But they're mandated, and they're doing it in the schools. So here you have every kid in the public schools, and there's something like, in the state of California, 6.3 million kids in public schools. So they're doing this in 5th, 7th, and 9th grade. They're recording the data. The data are public. You can get on your computer, and you can go to any school and see the data. And that data is not getting to the pediatrician's office. Now, wouldn't it be great if you had a really good California Fitnessgram, you had a really good set of tests, which the schools have to do anyway. We got it to the point where we really thought it was robust and really represented physical activity, and it was electronically goes to the doctor's office, and then you go in for your annual checkup, and it comes up on the electronic health record of the physician, and he or she sees what the results are. Now, the problem now would be that most pediatricians would have no idea how to interpret that data, but that's one of the things we want to fix. But we think this would be a really nifty way, one, to get the schools and the pediatricians to start talking to each other, because that's really, really critical, and it's not happening now. And second of all, it would give the pediatricians a way between 5th, 7th, and 9th grade to see what was happening with this child. And I think that would be brilliant. I don't know if you know this, but the American Academy of Pediatrics and the National Heart and Lung and Blood Institute have made an official recommendation that all children, not children with a family history of heart disease, but all children have a blood test for lipids between the ages of 8 and 11, and then again between the ages of 18 and 21. I don't know if you knew this, or I don't know if you have kids in that age. There's not many physicians are doing this because it's yet another blood test. And when these guidelines came out, it raised to me and to others a lot of problems. It's like, okay, so I take the 8 or 9-year-old, I do this blood test, I find that his or her triglycerides are high, I rule out these relatively rare familial causes, genetic causes of abnormally high cholesterols. What do I do at that point? If you read the guidelines, it says, well, you should encourage exercise. And it goes back to your first question. The pediatricians don't know how to do that. Or the child may come from, and we learned this so well, again, in this session earlier today, they may live in Santa Ana. And, we think of California as this breezy, airy place. There are fewer parks per person in Santa Ana than anywhere in the United States. And there are neighborhoods in Santa Ana where parents will not let their kids go out and play freely. And so they're stuck inside, and it's hard really to get the physical activity. So we seem to have these sort of parallel worlds where we think physical activity is important, we give it a lot of lip service, and then when we look at the field and we see what's happening, it's not happening. We know that there are 240 minutes of PE per week that are supposed to happen in schools, but when you go look at the schools and see what percentage of the time the kids are actually involved in physical activity, in some schools it's abysmal. Margaret was pointing this out, that in some schools this is what PE is. The kids come out, 15 minutes, they have a 40-minute period, 15 minutes for roll, then the kids line up to shoot a basket, and there's 50 kids, so each kid shoots the basket, and then it's time for their next class practically. So the physical activity isn't happening. And there was a lawsuit 2 years ago, and I have an article I could show you, in San Diego, where a group of parents actually brought this to court. And they said, yeah, you have the time. You're putting in the 240 minutes, at least on paper. But if you look at the kids, they're certainly not doing what is recommended moderate to vigorous physical activity, which is roughly a heart rate of about 140. It's not happening. So there are many low-hanging fruit in this problem for kids. And one of the things that we did show with Project Healthy is that in the pretty obese kids, you can change the school environment enough to keep these kids from that really severe greater than 95th percentile BMI class. So the school can work. It can be powerful if it just does what it should do. And I'm a fan of schools. I know that the schools, every social problem ends up, they go to the schools and say, you solve this. So I have great sympathy, and I understand the dilemma of the teachers. And kids who have learning disorders or autism, I understand that the parents want the schools to fulfill the law, but the schools are not given the resources to do this. And so unfortunately, you get this sort of tension and conflict all the time where the schools would love to have the resources to do it. They would love to provide every kid, who needs special ed, for example, those opportunities. But they're barely doing PE for the rest of the kids in a way that's really meaningful. And just to keep going with this point, if we have a child with a disease or a disability, the pediatrician is completely at a loss. I've had a family came to me, I remember, a child with congenital heart disease. And the child was operated on, and the major effects, the heart failure in this case, was ameliorated. So the parents wanted to know, what can my kid do? I mean, the kids want to be physically active, right? Their peers are physically active. Being physically active is a part of their social experience in life. And they related this story to me. They went to the surgeon who had done the operation, and they said, what can my kid do? And the surgeon said, anything he wants to. And then they went to the cardiologist, who was also taking care of the child, and they said, what can my kid do? And they said, he has to be very, very limited. You can't have him do regular PE. So when we're dealing with those kinds of kids who've had leukemia, survivors of prematurity, heart disease, lung disease, we really have a huge gap in our knowledge of how to treat those kids and what we should do in terms of physical activity. Do we have time for any more questions? Or are there any more questions?
How do you feel about the fast food industry for?
I love the fast food industry. Well, look, it's obvious that, the fast food industry, if you're eating a Big Mac and fries and a milkshake every day, this is not good for you. It's, I think, a bit too simplistic just to say they're the bad guys, and you know what I mean? The fast food industry is interesting. If you walk into a McDonald's now, you'll see a lot of choices right now, actually. And so the question is, yes, and they have advertised the hamburgers and everything like that. What did Joan say about her diet? She said, how did she describe her diet this morning? What is it? Seafood. Yeah, it was a seafood diet. So, I think, there are plenty of families that live close to fast food areas. There's just as many fast food areas. Let me give you an example. So when we wrote the original grant for Project Healthy, this is about 12 years ago, we used the School Health Index to look at the difference in physical fitness and body weight between kids in Santa Ana and kids in Newport Beach. So not surprisingly, the kids in Santa Ana had low physical activity and high BMI, and the kids in Newport Beach had the opposite. And there isn't a difference in the density of fast food outlets. There's a difference in the density and understanding of the parents. And when we started doing our work in lower socioeconomic neighborhoods, and we would go to a school, and we would say, we'd go to a school, for example, we went to Pomona or Santa Ana. We would want to have a meeting with the parents. And we were surprised. We would go to these meetings, the room would be jammed. Because in the Hispanic community, in the African American community, they understand what happens with type 2 diabetes. There isn't a family there that didn't have an abuela or somebody who had died from cardiovascular disease and they had diabetes. They knew it. But what really we need to do is education, and the family itself is the disruptive technology of this whole thing. And that's why when Frank Zaldivar was talking about how the family is involved in many of their community projects, that's part of the secret, is that you really have to change the whole unit. These things are easy to say and hard to do. So I don't blame necessarily the fast foods. I know there's arguments, that they over-advertise and things like that. It's probably true that they do, but I mean, should we stop eating really good French pastries? You know, should we ban those people as well? I mean, you know. Okay, well, this has been really fun, and thank you so much. And again, thanks to Jim. I mean, we're so proud of the EMSSI and everything that's done.